What is the 5-year rule on Roth IRA withdrawals? Do you really have to wait 5 years to withdraw Roth IRA contributions? And what 2 changes has President Obama proposed to IRAs? We'll answer these questions and more on this, the 105th episode of the DoughRoller Podcast.
Welcome to the DoughRoller Podcast, where the best thing money can buy is financial freedom. We help you make more, spend less, and invest the rest. And now your host, Rob Berger.
Whether you're just starting out, buried under a mountain of debt, or well on your way to financial freedom, this is the podcast to help you take your finances to the next level. Hey, everybody, this podcast is sponsored by Betterment, the most preferred automated investing service. Betterment has cutting-edge technology to optimize returns, minimize taxes, and save you time and money. Join over 34,000 customers who have already streamlined their portfolio management at betterment.com/roller. That's betterment.com/ROLLER. So glad to have you with us today, and got a packed show for you, one that I think you'll enjoy. We're going to actually be doing a number of things today. The first thing we're going to be doing is I pulled something out of the listener email, I guess mailbag, whatever you want to call it. But as I mentioned before, I just get a ton of email, and I'm, of course, once again, a little behind in responding, and for that I apologize. I'm working on catching up. But I want to make a better effort of showcasing some of the emails that you all send in, whether it's a question that you have that I'll do my best to answer, or just a tip. And today is more on the tip side. So we're gonna hear from a listener named Steve, who we've emailed back and forth a number of times on a number of topics. But he had a suggestion that some tips that I'm going to share with you. We're going to talk about a proposal that President Obama has made in his budget relating to IRA, something that you may not be aware of. And then we're going to dive into the main topic of today, and that is how the 5-year rule works on contributions to Roth IRAs, and specifically how that affects your ability to withdraw money from a Roth IRA, hopefully penalty and tax-free, right? So that's going to be the main topic. And then we're going to finish off with something that I haven't done in a while and I want to get back to, and that is a tool of the day. So I have an investing tool, particularly for those that are in retirement or near retiring, that I think you'll be particularly interested in. It's a free tool from Fidelity, and we're going to talk about that at the end of the show. So with that, let's sort of dive right into it. So here's the deal on the email from a listener named Steve. I had recorded, it was podcast 95, and that was a podcast in response to an email from a listener talking about basically where to stash your cash. When you've got cash, where should you put it? And there are a lot of different options, of course. And if you want to visit that show, you just go to DoughRoller.net/podcast95 and you can listen to it. But in response to that, Steve hit me up with an email with a couple of suggestions I didn't mention. And just wanted to kind of give Steve a shout out and share these with everybody. They may help you as you figure out how you want to manage your money. So the first one was considering a long-term CD, in this case a 5-year. He suggested a CD from Ally Bank. And the idea is this: yes, if you take out the money early, there will be a penalty. But effectively what Steve is saying is check out what the penalty is. It may be worth the risk in exchange for the higher interest rate. And at the time he sent me this email, which was probably, I hate to admit this, a couple of months ago, Ally was paying 1.6% on a 5-year CD. Today, that is as of September 2014, they're paying 2%, a annual percentage yield. So it's actually gone up significantly. And so that's one option. You can look at a longer-term CD. You do have to be aware of the penalties if you were to take out the money early. But, the penalty may be worth it to get that extra yield, and maybe you're reasonably confident you won't have to access that money right away. By the way, on the CDs and really all interest rates, I track them. Actually, there are a number of pages on DoughRoller where I track interest rates, and I have tools that I've embedded on the website that actually track them in real time. So they could change daily, and the tools automatically update. It's great for me. I don't have to sit there and check the interest rates every hour and update the pages. But what I do is on one page, I kind of bring all of the rates together: checking, savings, CDs, zero balance transfer card, mortgages, and bring them all together into one spot. That I update monthly. And the easy way to find it is just to go to DoughRoller.net/rates. rates, RATES, and that'll redirect you to the page. I don't have 5-year CDs on that page. I only have 1-year CDs, but in response to Steve's email, I'm going to add 5-year CDs on there. So I will do that before you listen to this podcast. So when you go to DoughRoller.net/rates, it will include the 5-year CDs. And what I do there is, rather than just giving you a long list, I pull out the best one that I can find. I list that on the page and then include a link to a fuller list of options if you wanted to look beyond what, at least from my research, is one of the best rates there. So I will do that. That's a good tip from Steve. He goes on, though. He says, a second option is what he calls a saving hack. There are some checking and savings accounts that will pay out a cash bonus when you open up a new account. Capital One 360 is one that Steve mentioned. It's one that I took advantage of. It's a very good one. But there are others. And one of the things he pointed out is, even if you have opened up an account like that and taken advantage of the bonus, maybe your significant other, your spouse, could do the same thing, because you can both open up these accounts in your individual names and then get the bonus. So that was his second tip. Again, I have a list of checking account promotions that I kind of keep track of. You'll find a link to that in the same page I mentioned just a minute ago, DoughRoller.net/rates. And incidentally, I have a link specifically to the Capital One 360 bonus because that's one that I'm just familiar with. So that's already on there. But I added, in response to Steve's email, a link to the checking promotion page as well. His third tip is to consider a Roth IRA as a place to store your cash. It grows tax-free, and Steve says you can take out the initial contributions anytime, penalty and tax-free. And that tip actually dovetails very nicely with today's topic. So just another reason why I included Steve's email today. This whole business, can you really withdraw from a Roth IRA, the contributions, penalty, and tax-free? Well, we're going to cover that today. And as you'll see, the answer is yes. Which does make a Roth IRA, if you qualify to open one, a potentially good option for holding some of your cash and hopefully not using it and letting it grow tax-free, but having that option to take out the contributions if you need to. So that was Steve's third suggestion. He rounded off. He had 4 tips, and he went all out on this email. He had 4 tips. The fourth one was, and this one he said is a little thinking outside the box, but make sure you're matching, you're contributing enough to your 401k to get the company match. And that may not be exactly how you want to stash an emergency fund, except that, you hate to give up free money. And that was Steve's point. So those are 4 good tips to consider as you figure out how best to manage your money. Steve, appreciate the email as always. Now, that brings us to President Obama's proposal, which this is new to me. I read it in the Wall Street Journal today, and the paper or the article was actually about leaving a Roth as to your heirs, as a part of your estate planning. Is that a good idea or not? The article was written by Andrea Combs of the Wall Street Journal, but as part of it, she mentioned 2 proposals in President Obama's 2015 budget that, if approved, would change a couple of things. And this was new to me, and I thought I'd pass it on. It's relevant to our topic today, at least somewhat, and I thought interesting. The first proposal in the budget, the President Obama's 2015 budget, is that it would require Roth IRA owners to start taking required minimum distributions at age 70 and a half. If you're at all familiar with an RMD, required minimum distribution, you probably know that there are no RMD requirements for a Roth IRA. But apparently, under his proposal, there would be. You would have to start taking out your money. Now, if you think about that, you think, well, why is that? You get to take it out at that point tax-free. So, why would the government care when you take it out? Well, my hunch is the thinking goes like this. If you're forced to take it out, then you have to do something with it, right? If you spend it, well, okay, you're pumping the money back into the economy, so the government might view that as a positive thing. And if, on the other hand, if you say, no, I want to keep saving it, well, what do? Well, you stick it in a taxable account where it no longer grows tax-free. Now the earnings, they may grow tax-deferred if you don't realize capital gains for a while, but you're going to pay taxes on the dividends and the interest and eventually on the capital gains. So that's my hunch behind the reason for that recommendation, is to basically just generate more taxable income for the government. So that's the first proposal, and the second one, a little different, and it has to do with inherited IRA. So when you inherit an IRA, if you're not the spouse of the deceased, you have a couple of options for how you take that money. You can take it out over you could withdraw it out all at once, but you'd get hit with taxes. So you have an option. You can take it out over a 5-year period. That at least defers your taxes for some period of time. Or you can basically do an RMD, a required minimum distribution, over your lifetime. And depending on how old you are, that could really stretch out the time you have to take the distributions. And of course, as a result, push out much further when you have to pay taxes on the distributions. I inherited a small IRA from my stepmother, and that's what I've chosen to do. I take the distributions out over my lifetime, and so that allows me to sort of avoid or defer the taxes for a fair amount of time. Under the proposal, though, that option would be gone. You'd have to take out the money within the first 5 years, which would effectively just accelerate the time you'd have to withdraw the money, and it would force you to effectively pay the taxes sooner. Right now, again, I don't think that proposal would affect, say, spouses. So there's still some exceptions, but it would force those, like in my case, for example, inheriting an IRA from my stepmother, to pull out the money sooner. And of course, as a result, pay taxes sooner. So those are the two proposals. I have no earthly idea if they're getting any traction in Congress. I kind of suspect not, only because I suspect not much of anything is getting any traction in Congress right now. But those were two of his proposals in his 2015 budget that could affect or would affect IRAs. I thought I'd share them with you. And again, it dovetails into today's topic. And today's topic is a complicated one. I'm going to be honest with you. And I've spent, I can't tell you how many hours trying to figure out how I can walk through this in a way that's fairly straightforward. So you can email me and tell me how I've done. It has to do with the 5-year rule on withdrawals for Roth IRAs. So I'm going to actually break this down into a couple of podcasts, because I think to stuff all of this in one would just be too mind-numbing. So it'd be too mind-numbing for me, so I can only imagine how it would feel for you all listening to this. So at a high level, let's talk about the 5-year rule. So the first thing to know is there are actually 2 5-year rules. Yes, I know. It couldn't just be one. No, it's 2, and they're different. They're both 5 years, but they're different. One applies to a withdrawal of your contributions. In other words, you have an IRA, you've made Roth IRA, I should say. You've made contributions to it. You've stroked a check and sent it off to Vanguard or Betterment or Schwab or Fidelity or Scottrade or whatever. You've opened up your Roth IRA and you've made that contribution. And it's sitting there hopefully earning a nice return. And what are the effects of withdrawing that money? Well, there's a couple of things you need to know. We're going to talk about those today. But one of them is this 5-year rule. And there's a version of it that applies to that scenario, that is contributions you've made to a Roth IRA. Now, you probably know that contributing to a Roth IRA is not the only way to get money into a Roth IRA. You can also convert what I'll call a traditional IRA into a Roth IRA. Well, if you do that, guess what? There is another 5-year rule that applies to conversions when it comes to withdrawing your money. Again, obviously from the name, they're both 5 years, right? That part's easy. But applying them is very, very different. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on the 5-year rule that applies to contributions. And then in an upcoming podcast, it probably won't be the next one, but it'll be very soon, I'm going to cover the 5-year rule as it applies to conversions. So today, it's just the 5-year rule as it applies to a Roth IRA contributions, okay? So that's what we're going to tackle today. And to start with, I want to run through 3, I call them the withdrawal rules. The 3 high-level rules as it applies to withdrawing from a Roth IRA. Okay? You ready? Here we go. Rule number 1. Roth IRA contributions are never taxed or subject to penalty when you withdraw them. If you contribute, we're not talking about a conversion now, a contribution, kind of going back to Steve's email as an option. It's why he mentioned the Roth IRA as an option for managing maybe an emergency fund. you can always and at any time withdraw contributions you have made to a Roth IRA, tax-free and penalty-free. You can make a $5,000 Roth IRA contribution today and take it out next week, next month, next year, penalty and tax-free, regardless of how old, the whole 59 and a half, don't have to worry about it. It doesn't matter if you're in retirement or not. You can always take out your Roth IRA contributions, tax and penalty free. And that kind of makes sense if we think about it, because with a Roth IRA, you're contributing after-tax dollars, right? You've already paid the man, right? You've already paid Uncle Sam. You've already been taxed on it. This is after-tax dollars. You can take out the contributions at any time. Now, before I get to the other two rules, one thing I want to mention is that doesn't apply to earnings. We're going to talk about that. But for example, let's say you put $5,000 in and you wait a year and now you've got $6,000. Well, you've got $5,000 of contributions, right? And you've got $1,000 of earnings, whether that's dividends or interest, or maybe you've just invested in a stock mutual fund and the values have gone up. So this rule number one only applies to the contribution portion of what's in your Roth IRA, not any earnings. All right, I want to make that clear. So again, for your contributions, you can withdraw them anytime you want, tax-free and penalty-free. That's rule number one. Okay. Rule number two deals with what qualifies as a qualified distribution. When you want to withdraw from a Roth IRA, remember the contribution portion, that's always tax-free and penalty-free. But what about the earnings? If you are going to withdraw the earnings, right, when is that withdrawal free of tax and free of penalty? They call that a qualified withdrawal. Well, in order for you to take out your Roth IRA earnings, free of tax and free of penalties, you got to meet two rules. The first one is you got to satisfy that 5-year rule. That's the whole topic of today's podcast. We're going to look at it in detail in a minute, but you got to satisfy that 5-year rule. That's the first thing. And then you have to meet one of basically four qualifications. The one that I think most people are familiar with is you have to be 59 and a half or older. Now, that's not the only one. You can also be disabled, as defined by the IRS. There's a first-time home buyer exception, right? And this last one you're not going to like very much, but you can be dead, okay? And your beneficiaries, deal with it. So for today's podcast, we're going to ignore the being dead. We're going to ignore the disabled, and we're going to ignore the first-time home buyer exception. Yes, those are all good, but just to kind of simplify what we're talking about, we're going to focus on the rule that most people deal with, and that is being 59 and a half, okay? But remember, there are other exceptions. Again, the disabled, the first-time home buyer exception, and so on. So for the earnings to represent a qualified withdrawal or distribution, you need to satisfy the 5-year rule, and you need to be 59 and a half. Or one of those other exceptions we're not going to talk about in the podcast. The 5-year rule, and you need to be 59 and a half, okay? That's sort of the second rule of withdrawing from a Roth IRA. Now, the third one is an interesting one. I mentioned the first one, you can withdraw your contributions at any time, but not your earnings. That depends. And I used the example of you contributing $5,000 to a Roth IRA, and then the next year, looking at your account, you've got $6,000 in there because you've earned $1,000. Now, in that example, let's say you withdraw $5,000. Well, how does the IRS treat that? Is that all considered contributions, so there's no tax or penalty? Is the first $1,000, do they try to stick it to you, and the first $1,000 is considered earnings, and the other 4 contributions, so you do pay tax? Is it some combination of the two? Well, that gets us to our third rule on withdrawals, and that is the order. What is the order that the IRS treats these withdrawals? Well, the first thing it does is it says your withdrawals come from your contributions. So they actually they got the taxpayers back on this one, believe it or not. So as you withdraw money from a Roth IRA, it's going to first be attributed to any contributions you've made. And once your withdrawals exceed the amount you've contributed, the next thing they treat it as is conversions. If you've converted any, say, traditional IRAs to a Roth IRA, they're going to treat the money being taken out as if it had been converted. And then only when all of the money that's been converted has sort of been eaten up, the third and final category is earnings. So when you make a distribution or you take a withdrawal from a Roth IRA, that's how the IRS treats the withdrawal. So in our example, if you had contributed $5,000 over a year, it earned another $1,000, so you've got $6,000 total, and you withdrew $5,000, that would all be treated as withdrawing contributions. You wouldn't be taxed. You wouldn't be penalized, because remember, that's rule number one: contributions can always be withdrawn tax and penalty free. And the $1,000 that you have left in there, of course, would all be deemed earnings, right? In our example, there were no converted assets. They would all be deemed earnings, but you haven't withdrawn those. So they still sit there, and that's good, right? But that order of withdrawal is very important, and it's sort of the third rule to keep in mind when you're thinking through withdrawals from a Roth IRA. Now, I kind of walked through that, maybe quickly, I don't know, but I will have all that listed out in the show notes, which you'll be able to find at DoughRoller.net/podcast105. So you'll be able to go to that to see that. But those are sort of my high-level rules of withdrawing from a Roth IRA. Now, I mentioned in there that 5-year rule. So this is what I want to drill down on today. And again, we're focused just on the 5-year rule as it applies to a Roth IRA contribution. So how do you satisfy that rule? Well, first of all, when does the rule begin? If you make a contribution to a Roth IRA, that starts the clock when? Does it start as of the day you actually make the contribution, or something else? Well, the answer is this. It starts the clock running as of January 1 of the tax year in which the contribution applies. So, for example, if you make a contribution on June 1 of 2014, so that's a couple of months ago. So let's say you made a Roth IRA contribution on June 1 of 2014, and you meant it to apply to your 2014 tax year, then you will have started the clock running as of January 1, 2014. Okay? Now, let's imagine you have not yet made a contribution, and you're going to make one when you file your taxes in April of 2015. So on April, let's say 5th of 2015, you make a Roth IRA contribution for the 2014 tax year. Well, that will start the clock running as of January 1, 2014. So it actually goes back in time and starts the 5 years, the 5-year clock. So again, the clock starts to run on January 1 of the tax year for which the contribution applies, right? That's the first thing to know about this 5-year rule as it relates to Roth IRA contributions. The second thing to understand is this. You don't have to satisfy the rule for each and every contribution you make. Once you satisfy the rule for your very first contribution, it satisfies the rule for all future contributions. The clock doesn't start over each time you make a contribution. That's the good news, right? You make the contribution, let's say, when you're 35, for example. Well, when you're 40, you've satisfied the 5-year rule, and it's satisfied for life. You don't have to start all over again, say, when you make a contribution when you're 50, right? So once you've satisfied this 5-year rule for Roth IRA contributions, you've satisfied it. You can check that box off. Good for you. Now, when we get to the podcast on the 5-year rule as it relates to conversions, you'll realize that is not true on a Roth IRA conversion. When it comes to conversions, the 5-year rule has to be satisfied for each and every individual conversion. Again, I'm not going to dive into that today. Maybe you can see why I'm trying to break this apart and do it bit by bit. But for IRA contributions, Roth IRA contributions, once you've satisfied that rule, you've made that first contribution, and 5 years later, you're done. As it relates to Roth IRA contributions, you've satisfied the rule. Now, the third thing I want to mention about the 5-year rule is it has to be satisfied even if you're already 59 and a half. Turning 59 and a half doesn't obviate doesn't release you of the requirement to satisfy this 5-year rule. So if you're 58, for example, and you, for the very first time, make a contribution to a Roth IRA, yes, it'll be good when you turn 59 and a half. That has some significance, as we'll see in a minute. But you still have to satisfy that 5-year rule if you want to avoid taxes on the earnings from your Roth IRA. So don't just assume that because you've turned 59 and a half, you no longer have to worry about the 5-year rule as it relates to the Roth IRA contribution, because you do. Now, I got to tell you, as I was researching for today's, I can't tell you how many hours I've put in on this podcast. Believe it or not, just as a little background in the way my crazy mind works, this podcast today started out as a podcast on ways in which you can tap retirement and other sources of income if you want to retire early. You want to retire at 55. How do you get at some of your money? And I am going to do that podcast. But as I was researching material for that podcast, I started drilling down. I looked at the Roth IRA as one option. And then, of course, you get the 5-year rule. And it just got so complicated. I thought, no, I need to break this down before I can even get to the podcast about early retirement. I've got that on my to-do list. But in doing the research for this, you'd see some articles on the internet that had literally flowcharts, complicated flowcharts on how to figure out what your taxes and your penalties will be, if any. Long, dense articles, just paragraph after paragraph explaining this. It gets very, very complicated. The best way I saw of folks explaining the rules was simply to break it down between whether you're 59 and a half or older or not, and then whether you've met the 5-year rule or not. So let's walk through that. I think this will make it, a little easier to follow, and then I'm going to give a couple of examples. So if you think about it, we've got kind of two elements here. Are you 59 and a half or older or not? And have you met the 5-year rule or not? Those are the two sort of options, and if you put them together, there are 4 variations, right? You're over 50, you're 59 and a half or older, and you've met the 5-year rule, or you're 59 and a half or older, and you've not met the 5-year rule. And then the same 2 options if you're under 59 and a half. Those are the 4 options. So what happens? Well, let's look at them. If you're 59 and a half or older, and you've met the 5-year rule, well, that's the gold standard, right? That's exactly how all of this is designed to work. You're in retirement, you've met this 5-year rule, no taxes or penalties when you withdraw from your Roth IRA. That's sort of the perfect scenario, right? Good. Well, what if you're 59 and a half or older and you have not met the 5-year rule? So, for example, you contributed to a Roth IRA for the very first time at age 58. And you're now 60 or 61, and you want to withdraw money from your Roth IRA, what's going to happen? Well, remember, the first thing is, if you're withdrawing your contributions, no taxes or penalties, right? So we're only talking about if you then have to dip into your earnings, right? What happens then? You're 59 and a half or older, but you have not met the 5-year rule. You take out all your contributions, and now you're dipping into earnings. What will happen? Well, you'll pay taxes. You'll pay ordinary income tax on the earnings you withdraw, but no penalty, right? Not a great result, by the way. Yeah, you avoid the 10% penalty, but now you're paying ordinary income tax on the earnings of a Roth IRA, which, of course, is designed to avoid that. So not a good result. So the 5-year rule can really bite you if you're not aware of it, and you kind of came late to the game of contributing to a Roth IRA. But again, remember, this is a scenario where you're 59 and a half or older, you have not met the 5-year rule, but you're also dipping into the Roth IRA and have withdrawn all of your contributions and then dipping more into it and taking out earnings. Because remember, the first withdrawals will be attributed to your contributions. So this hopefully doesn't apply to many of you, but it might, or it might apply to someone you know. Maybe you're helping parents with their retirement, or maybe you're in retirement and you started late on the Roth IRA contributions. It's an important rule to understand. Okay, those are the 2 scenarios if you've qualified under the 59 and a half rule. What if you're under 59 and a half? What happens? Well, here's the deal. The same thing happens whether you've met the 5-year rule or not. Taxes and penalties on the earnings. If you're under 59 and a half, and remember, there are other exceptions, the disability, the first-time home buyer, we're kind of ignoring those for today. We're just focusing on the 59 and a half. But if you've not hit that 59 and a half mark, you're going to pay taxes and penalties if you withdraw the earnings, regardless of whether you've met the 5-year rule or not. So the whole 5-year rule, as it relates to contributions, really comes into play when you're 59 and a half, when you've met that requirement, but you've not met the 5-year rule. You'll pay taxes, but no penalty. Hope you followed all that. Again, I'll have those scenarios set out in the show notes. I know that it can be mind-numbingly confusing. I wish it weren't the case, but unfortunately it is. I don't write the rules. I just do my best to understand them and pass them on to you. So a couple of examples. If you're under 59 and a half, as I mentioned, you will pay taxes and penalties on withdrawal of earnings regardless of whether the 5-year rule is met. I guess this is more of a summary than an example. I'll get to the examples in a second. If you're under 59.5, you will pay taxes and penalties on withdrawal of earnings regardless of whether your 5-year rule is met. If you're 59.5 or older, you'll pay tax but not penalties on withdrawal of earnings if the 5-year rule is not met. If the 5-year rule is met and you're 59.5 or older, no taxes or penalties. That's sort of a summary of the whole thing. So a couple of quick examples just to try to make this even more confusing. So let's say you're 50. You contribute $100 to a Roth IRA. And you just let it sit there. Then at age 58, you contribute $6,500. And 2 years later at age 60, you have a Roth IRA balance of $8,000 because it's had some earnings, and you withdraw the whole thing. What happens? Well, there's no tax or penalties. Why? Well, you've met the 59.5 rule, right, because you're now 60, and you've met the 5-year rule because at age 50, you contributed $100 to a Roth IRA. That's all it took. And once that contribution satisfied the 5-year rule, which it did when you turned 55, you've satisfied it. You don't have to satisfy it again on the contribution you made at 58. Once you satisfy it as it relates to contributions, you've satisfied it. All right? How about a different scenario? You didn't contribute $100 to a Roth IRA at age 50. Instead, you waited till you were 58, and you contributed $6,500. And then at age 60, you had a Roth IRA balance of, we'll say, $8,000. You did pretty good. You withdraw $6,500. What's the result there? Well, no taxes or penalties. Why? Because remember, the withdrawals first get attributed to contributions. And since you contributed $6,500 and then you withdrew $6,500, the IRS would treat that distribution or that withdrawal as representing your contributions. And there's never a tax or penalty when you withdraw your contributions from a Roth IRA. So the remaining balance of, I guess, $1,500 would be deemed earnings. So if you later took that out, you'd have to evaluate this all over again. But that in that example, you were just withdrawing your contribution, so you're good. Now, similar scenario, age 58, you contribute $6,500. At age 60, you've got a balance of $8,000, just like before. But this time, rather than withdrawing or distributing $6,500, let's just say you took the whole thing out, $8,000. So what would happen? Well, $6,500 would be deemed as a withdrawal distribution of your contributions, so no taxes or penalty there. But you would also be deemed to have withdrawn $1,500 of earnings, right? So you'd pay taxes, but you wouldn't pay a penalty. Well, there you go. I told you that this is just half the equation. We haven't even gotten to the 5-year rule as it relates to Roth IRA conversions. I know this, as I said, it can be mind-numbing. I'm going to put this all in the show notes. And, the thing is, I would say, I do my best to get this stuff right. And in the show notes, I will link to many of the sources that I've used, including the IRS and some other very good websites that I trust, and you can check those out. But as always, if you're in the process of doing some serious retirement planning, I highly encourage you to work with a financial planner or other retirement expert to make sure you get the rules right. They are extremely complicated. So there you go. As I said, I'll follow up here in a little bit with a podcast on the 5-year rule as it relates to conversions. Very different on a number of fronts. So very important that you listen to that podcast if you've got Roth IRAs that were converted. So now on to the tool of the day. This was an interesting tool that I came across from Fidelity, and you don't have to have an account. You have to sign up if you want to use it. But it's called the Fidelity Income Strategy Evaluator. So if you just search in Google for that, the Fidelity Income Strategy Evaluator, you'll see the tool. And I've used it. One thing I'll say is you need to be prepared to spend some time with it. This is not kind of throw in a couple of numbers and hit a button. If you have a Fidelity account, it will bring in your assets into the tool that you have there with Fidelity. But it can also look at other assets that you have, and you can add those manually if you want to. And it basically slices and dices your investments from an asset allocation perspective, and it looks at what you're going to need in retirement. And you have to provide a lot of that information. You can kind of do it in a very detailed format in terms of what your budget's going to be, or you can kind of do it at a high level. That's up to you. And it will then determine options for generating income in retirement. Whether it's from taxable accounts, retirement accounts, even looking at annuities, fixed and variable. And then kind of gives an assessment of whether you're going to meet your goal or not. And it can include, say, for example, savings for an emergency fund and other reserves that you want. It's a very detailed tool. So again, this is not something that you can sit down and in a couple of minutes get some kind of answer that's meaningful. I would suggest, if you're going to use it, at least 30 minutes and maybe 60 or maybe more, depending on how much detail you want to put into it. But I think particularly if you're in retirement or near retirement, I think the tool could be very helpful in helping you evaluate your strategy for generating income in retirement. So again, it's the Fidelity Income Strategy Evaluator. By the way, if you're listening and you've used that tool before, I'd love to hear from you. Shoot me an email, tell me what you think. I've used it some, but of course I'm not in retirement yet, so doesn't have sort of the same meaning for me yet as it would for someone that's in or near retirement. So if you've used it before, we'd love to hear from you. Again, it's the Fidelity Income Strategy Evaluator. And there you go. Hopefully you find that helpful. And as always, you can shoot me an email, dr@DoughRoller.net. I'm a little behind, and I apologize for that, but I'm doing my best to keep up with all of the email I've been receiving. It's terrific. Love to hear from you. And I know today's topic was a bit complicated. As I said, I will kind of lay this out in the show notes, so it may be just as easy to look at that. Again, that'll be at DoughRoller.net/podcast 105. And that brings this podcast to a close. Remember, until next time, the best thing money can buy is financial freedom.